This week, we're introducing a new podcast from the Baker Institute, The Two-Handed Economist, a show that delivers clear-eyed, up-to-the-minute analysis of economic policy developments from John Diamond, the director of our Center for Tax and Budget Policy. This is a show for anyone looking for a common-sense perspective on policy issues and the state of the economy, mostly at the federal level, but with insights now and again into fiscal issues in Texas and Houston as well. Every week, John will dive deep into the latest developments in the economy and explain what it means for consumers, businesses, and policymakers. And by the way, that term, two-handed economist, comes from a Harry Truman expression. He famously said, "I'd like to have an economist with one hand. I'm tired of hearing on the one hand and then on the other hand." On this podcast, John is going to embrace the complexity that a one-handed economist might shy away from. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Two-Handed Economist, where we tackle the complexity that a one-handed economist might shy away from. Today we're talking all things Trump tariffs. What's transpired in the past? What are the politics, and what does it mean for the U.S. and world economies? I'm John Diamond. I'm the director of the Center for Tax and Budget Policy at Rice University's Baker Institute. I've been here roughly 20 years. Before that, I worked on the Hill in D.C. I've studied economics for the past 35 years. The purpose of this podcast is to discuss policy issues and the state of the economy from a common sense viewpoint. We've titled the podcast The Two-Handed Economist, contrary to Truman's request for someone to bring him a one-handed economist, because I think he was tired of hearing on the other hand. However, we're going to look at issues from every angle, so you're going to hear a lot of on the other hands. It's April 15th, tax day in the United States, but that's really not the big news of the last 2 weeks. I think everybody's been a little preoccupied with tariffs. So tariffs have been a major issue. Pretty much not a day's gone by that something hasn't changed. February 1st, the administration announced major tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico. It's kind of hard to make sense of why we were tariffing our three biggest trading partners, two of which we're actually friends with and have a trade agreement. But that is what it is. On March 4th, the tariffs were due to take effect. Broad duties were to hit all trade flows. Several pauses. The tariffs were off again, on again throughout this period. And it was hard to figure out exactly where the administration was going. But they continued to point to April 2nd, which they called Liberation Day. And when we finally got to Liberation Day, the administration imposed tariffs on all countries, 10% on nearly all imports. We hit China with a 34% tariff, Vietnam with a 46% tariff, India with a 27% tariff, Japan with a 24% tariff, and the EU with a 20% tariff, regardless of the fact that most of these countries don't impose tariffs anywhere near that level on us. Those tariffs spooked the market. Stocks were sent into a tailspin, the dollar was weakening, and bonds were going up in yield, down in price. This led to a situation on April 8th where the bond market flashed warning signs of liquidity issues. Not surprisingly, the next day, we had the pause on April the 9th in the reciprocal tariffs. However, over that period, we had seen China retaliate, which was followed by a U.S. retaliation. And so the tariff rates on China had continued to skyrocket. As of April 9th, we have 125% reciprocal tariff on China, with an additional 20% from the fentanyl tariffs earlier in the year, a total tariff on China of 145%. We've paused all other reciprocal tariffs and have just imposed a 10% tariff across the board. Although shortly after April 9th, the administration allowed for several exemptions on cell phones, computers, and semiconductor chips. This is common in a tariff world. It's part of the problem with tariffs. It becomes a political issue, And ultimately, we don't want our politicians picking winners and losers in who manufactures what and where they manufacture it. So I see these exemptions as a big problem, even though the administration now is saying that these are only temporary exemptions and that sector-specific tariffs are on the horizon in the next few months, which I don't expect the market will react well to them either. New tariffs are expected on copper, lumber, semiconductors, and pharmaceuticals. The big news, though, was not that the pause reduced the average tariff rate for the U.S., it was that it just held it constant. It was just a redistribution of tariffs from Vietnam, India, Japan, and the EU to China. This is a real problem for the American economy. These tariffs will slow down the economy. They'll lead to higher prices, and they're going to lead to instability in all world markets. The administration needs to reverse course. We need a low tariff policy, and we need to try to achieve our goals in a different manner. But the real fearful thing in that week was the bond market. The bond market was treating the U.S. as if it was a third world country. On top of that, in the same week, the House passed its budget plan. And that budget plan aims to increase the U.S. budget deficit by an additional $5 to $6 trillion. So on top of our $36 trillion in debt, we're going to add another $5 or $6 trillion. At the same time, we have policies that are throwing the bond markets into chaos. This is not good economics. It's not good policy. But the real question is, should we have these tariffs at all? Like, what's the real need for these tariffs? The administration's story is manufacturing has left the U.S., and we need to do this to reshore industry and to bring back all of the manufacturing to the United States. And, that may make sense in some areas. Obviously, for any good that is important for national security, anything that we need to produce to not be dependent on countries that are adversarial, it makes a lot of sense to make sure that we are producing or that we have the capability to produce those goods. That does not mean that a tariff is the best mechanism to do that. There's other tools other than tariffs that could be used, but this administration seems intent on using tariffs to accomplish all goals, reshoring of industries across the board. And that raises a lot of questions. And it's contrary to the thoughts of several great thinkers. For instance, John Stuart Mill pointed out the real gain to foreign trade to any country lies not in its exports, but in its imports. Similarly, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations said, in every country, it always is and must be the interest of the great body of the people to buy whatever they want of those who sell it cheapest. So we have a real conflict of ideas here. On the one side are economists and thinkers that think the consumer should be able to buy the products they want at the cheapest price. And on the other side is a very industrial protective policy where we want to protect American industries from foreign competition in order to bring their production back to the U.S. And the question is, does that make sense from an economic view? I'm not certain it does. I think the cost of bringing back manufacturing large scale may be understated, and I think the benefits are being overstated. In fact, the administration always points to the decline in employment in the manufacturing industry as one of the reasons, and they are correct, that employment in the manufacturing sector has declined, and it's declined from 1980 to 2025 by about 7 million jobs. But it's important to realize that not all of those 7 million jobs were lost because of factories moving abroad or foreign competition. About half would have been lost because of innovation. Innovation makes us better off by allowing us to produce more goods at lower cost, i.e. we use less resources to produce more goods than we did previously. That's a hands-down win for the consumer and the economy. Just like if we're able to buy a good cheaper from abroad, that also is a win for the economy. The consumer can get the same good they could get from an American producer, plus they can have money left over to buy other goods. This administration, at least, seems to be fully focused only on employment in the manufacturing sector and not output in the manufacturing sector. If you look at output from 1980 to 1925, it's gone up continuously. In fact, it's gone up fairly rapidly. That's because there's been a tremendous increase in productivity in the manufacturing sector, which has led to greater output while we use less and less labor, more and more capital. So what do we make of this? Can we improve our economy by imposing tariffs? I'm going to say no. If you just think about it from a simple perspective, the administration's goal is to balance trade. So they want imports and exports to be equal. In fact, Trump has said having a trade deficit is like losing. So it's almost a competition to him. But that's really not the right way to look at trade. As we discussed, many famous economists actually think what you import is how you measure the benefits of trade. But let's think about the logic behind this. So first of all, the administration only references trade in goods. They rarely talk about trade in services, where the United States maintains a surplus in services. So we export more than we import. We export about 1.1 trillion in services in 2024, and we imported about 810 billion. In goods, which is where the administration places its concern, we imported 3.3 trillion in goods. We exported 2.8 trillion in goods. So there's about a 1.2 trillion deficit in goods. Now, let's think about how we would close this. There's only two ways to close it. You can either import less. Let's say we imported 1.2 trillion less, or you can export 1.2 trillion more. The question is that even possible? If we imported 1.2 trillion less, unless there's greater goods output in the U.S., that would imply a 1.2 trillion reduction in consumption by American consumers. Well, that definitely wouldn't make us better off. So if the question then is could we produce 1.2 trillion more in goods? And I would say on that front, it's unlikely. Unemployment is currently relatively low. Where are we going to get the labor to produce an additional 1.2 trillion in goods from where we are now if we're not importing those goods? Especially considering that if you think about basic economics in a supply and demand diagram, demand curves are downward sloping, but supply curves are upward sloping. And the supply curve represents the marginal cost curve. So it's the marginal cost of producing an additional good. So where we sit right now, if we want to produce more goods, we don't produce them at the cost that we produced all of the prior goods. The marginal cost of production is increasing because to produce another good, you have to bid resources away from other productive activities. And to do that requires more and more dollars. And so it would be more expensive. So it's not clear to me what the rationale is, because I don't think it's possible, given the resources available to the United States, to just produce an additional 1.2 trillion in output in order to replace the 1.2 trillion in imports that we would be losing if we balanced trade through a reduction in imports. We run into the same problem on the export side. Are we going to export an additional 1.2 trillion in goods? If so, how are we going to produce those goods? With what labor? The labor supply is falling. Demographics are a major force. So I'm not sure. Certainly innovation is one way we could increase output to the extent that innovation leads to more productive workers. But that's a long-term phenomenon. That's not something that you just change immediately. So to put this in perspective, is it possible to balance trade? I would say it's not possible. We don't have the workers to produce an extra 1.2 trillion in goods. And to the extent that we do not produce an extra 1.2 trillion, then the impact of trade would just be higher prices for the goods we consume and less consumption. That doesn't make anyone better off. In fact, I would argue that that would reduce the welfare of the average person in the United States. Even the Econ 101 simple story of imposing a tariff shows this pretty clearly. When you impose a tariff, you raise the price of the imported good. You get less imports of the good from abroad. You do get an increase in production in the protected industry, but then you also get a decrease in economic efficiency, a decrease more than likely of the productions of other goods in the economy. So there's a lot of impacts from imposing a tariff, some good, some bad. But the net effect is going to be a reduction in welfare, a reduction in people's standard of living. In addition, there's a recent paper out that shows that tariffs are related to slower growth, slower innovation, because American firms don't have to compete as hard. When you reduce competition, you reduce the incentive for firms to produce goods at the lowest cost with the most efficiency. So tariffs are going to increase prices, reduce our consumption and the number of choices we have, and reduce innovation. That's not a good combination. And the current administration needs to rethink its trade policy. None of this is new either. It's not like we don't have plenty of examples to look at. Shifting to some historical references, we can look back all the way to 1890 and see the effects of the McKinley tariffs at a time when tariffs were roughly 50%. That tariff increase hurt consumers, devastated farmers, and contributed to economic instability. It was a time when the U.S. had expanded rapidly. The railroads had expanded and taken on large amounts of debt. The economic instability of a slowing economy, the impact of the tariffs, and the general overhang of having too much leverage in the economy led to the Panic of 1893, which was probably similar in some ways to the financial crisis of 2008, where we had just overextended our dependence on leverage and debt to finance current consumption. Shortly after that, in the period from 1910 to 1930, we went into an era where we were reducing tariffs. And oddly enough, the economy boomed for a 20-year period before 1929 when the economy crashed. We responded in 1929 by closing our doors to imports with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. That triggered substantial retaliation from our foreign trade partners and led to a deepening of the Great Depression as well as a lengthening of the Great Depression. That's a time we should look to avoid. Under Nixon, tariffs were not successful. We thought we could put in 10% across the board surcharge in order to increase America's competitive advantages, and instead we just ended up with rising prices. The administration was forced to put in price and wage controls, and we had another decade of rising prices and slowing economic growth. As Reagan took office in 1980, the misery index was at an all-time high, the combination of unemployment and inflation. And the Fed had to respond by raising rates at a time when the economy was in recession. Fed Chairman Volcker had to make tough decisions in the late 70s and early 80s about monetary policy. He chose to raise rates, which was vastly different than his predecessor, Arthur Burns, had done. But Burns's action had led to inflation and unemployment. Volcker's actions, while painful immediately, eventually led us out of the crisis and into one of the longest periods of sustained economic growth that the country had ever known. Volcker's actions led to a sustained period of economic growth and economic vitality, which was the envy of the world for some time. The current Fed is potentially going to have to make the same difficult choice. We're not in the world we were in 1978, 1979, but the tea leaves sure do read like we're headed in the same direction. The last experiment with tariffs was in 2018 under the Trump administration. We raised tariffs on steel, solar panels, and washers. The administration has tried to make these out as successful, but when you really look at the data, the price of these items went up. Farmers were hurt significantly and had to be given subsidies of nearly $40 billion to offset just a portion of the losses they faced from the retaliation from China. And we saw little reshoring of American industry. In fact, I would say job losses in the rest of the economy and the harm imposed on consumers by rising prices would have outweighed any of the gains we saw from new production in any of these industries. So overall, the historical narrative, the historical evidence for the effects of trade are pretty clear. Tariff policy leads to higher prices, retaliation, and limited gains for domestic industries. And we should really avoid these policies. There's plenty of other options in terms of supporting American industries without using tariffs. And these would include things like negotiating better trade deals, which to Trump's credit, he negotiated a pretty good trade deal with Mexico and Canada through the USMCA, and that deal will be up for renegotiation in 2026. We can support domestic industries without blocking trade just by offering them tax incentives and subsidies. Or we can invest in the competitiveness of the U.S. economy by shifting more towards infrastructure investment, R&D, improvements in education of those that have their jobs impacted by trade-related issues. And we can do all this in order to increase the rate that we innovate, which will lead to greater output, lower prices, and a higher standard of living. Here are the key takeaways from this week. A, tariffs have winners and losers and are more political than economic. B, the economic effects of tariffs are negative overall. They can lead to economic instability, and they can really reduce economic innovation and the welfare of U.S. citizens. It would be smart if the administration shifted gears away from tariff into other mechanisms to incentivize U.S. producers to innovate and to create more at home. And lastly, the thought that we can produce everything for ourselves, especially given the level of our wealth compared to other countries in the world who have cheaper labor, ample resources available in their economies, is so far from reality, it's hard to even fathom why this administration is thinking it. Trade among countries makes us all better off. And we seem to be very focused on the fact that over the last 70 years, trade has raised other countries up. We seem to not be focused on the fact that it's also raised us up, made us wealthier, giving us more choices. It's okay for everyone to be better off. It's okay to have a rising tide that lifts all boats. That's true across countries just as much as it's true within countries. And we should aim to continue on the road of free trade and greater wealth around the world and not be so focused on just ourselves and what we do here, because honestly, we can't produce enough to meet all of our needs, desires, and wants. It's only through trade that we can maximize our well-being. So looking forward, how should we respond? It's really pretty simple. The administration should immediately reverse course and lower tariffs, not raise them. We should use diplomacy and hard-nosed actions to confront China on all of its unfair trade practices, all of its attempts to steal the IP of U.S. companies. But we can do that without throwing the world into economic chaos. We should focus on making America a stronger economy, a faster growing economy, and a more innovative economy. We can do that by supporting industries that are important for national security reasons. Instead of using tariffs, we can subsidize those industries and give them tax incentives to increase the output in those industries. We can also use non-tariff barriers to incentivize American productions of goods that are clearly important for national security reasons. We should continue to seek out new deals with our trading partners, and we should work with trading partners more closely to align our countries in the same direction. By doing so, we can use those partnerships to hopefully move China in a direction to be a better actor in the world. We should aim to enrich other countries. Trade should be a rising tide that lifts all boats, not one simply focused on ourselves. Finally, the U.S. must pass a sustainable U.S. fiscal policy. We can't continually run deficits and expect other countries to finance those deficits. We must start to pay for our current consumption with current dollars and quit shifting the burden onto future generations. having such an unsustainable policy only increases the risk of economic downturns and threatens the financial stability that we've often offered the world. Continuing on the path of skyrocketing deficits and debt will shift the world away from America as the most stable nation. We must return to being a stable and reliable partner with a sustainable fiscal trajectory that sets the course for the next century. The Two-Handed Economist is produced by the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Production support was provided by Karina Zamel, Shannon Moriarty, and Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org for more, and thank you for listening.